Emily's Stories warmly welcomes all of our cherished listeners. In today's broadcast, we invite you to enjoy a captivating short story titled Love Story with My Stepmother by an anonymous friend. We hope this story brings you moments of relaxation and intrigue. After listening, don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to support Emily and our dedicated team. When single parents make the choice to move forward in their personal lives, they often hope it will bring more love and stability to their families. A new father or mother figure can offer affection, but welcoming a new member into the home can also create delicate and complex relationships, particularly between children and their new stepparents. Today's story revolves around such a relationship, a complicated one between a 20-year-old stepson and his young, beautiful stepmother. Boundaries between them were crossed, despite the young man's reasoning. How will they manage to keep their family peaceful? Dear listeners, many intriguing pages await us. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay with us through many more emotional moments each day. And now, let's dive into the captivating events of today's story. In a dimly lit living room, a child around 8 years old sat curled up at the bottom of the stairs, watching as a young couple argued. The woman, dressed in a tight black dress, was holding a suitcase ready to leave. The man, sitting helplessly on the sofa, asked, "Do you really have to go this far, Lily? Haven't I tried my best this whole time? Why can't you understand, Twinks?" The woman burst into tears. 8 years, Jake. I've trusted you for 8 years. I've endured so much, but I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry, but I'll apologize to my parents and go back home. If fate allows, maybe we'll meet again. Goodbye." With that, she hurried out the door, climbed into a waiting car, and disappeared from sight. Jake sat on the sofa, pulling at his hair in frustration, shouting, "Why? Why?" The child watching all this sobbed, "Mom, please don't leave me. Please, Mom." That poor, helpless child was me, Ethan. I'm 20 years old now and a second-year student at the National Economics University. I am the product of a young love affair between two college students. My father, Jake, was in his final year at the university when he fell in love with my mother, who was a freshman at law school. My mother got pregnant unexpectedly, and her parents were furious. They forced her to choose between an abortion or leaving the family, and because she loved me, she chose the latter. My parents struggled through life in Hanoi, a bustling city where everything was expensive. My father had to balance both school and work to provide for our little family. He graduated shortly after I was born and found a job at a consumer goods company with a starting salary of 7 million dong a month. But the cost of rent, food, and my baby supplies quickly drained their finances. The pressure of supporting a family weighed heavily on his shoulders. By the time I was 5, my parents managed to scrape together their savings and took out a loan to build a small house in Hanoi. However, their financial troubles worsened when my father invested heavily in the stock market against my mother's wishes. At first, the stocks rose rapidly and he was confident, but soon the market crashed, wiping out everything they had saved. My mother was devastated, and the stress of the financial burden proved too much. She filed for divorce and returned to her parents, leaving me with my father. I stayed in the countryside with my paternal grandparents while my father worked tirelessly in Saigon to rebuild our lives. By the time I started middle school, my father had paid off his debts and secured a stable career. He moved back to Hanoi, and I went to live with him. Our lives became more comfortable, and he gave me everything I needed. He took care of me with so much love and attention that I felt both grateful and guilty for my past resentment toward him. One evening, during a casual dinner, my father asked me, "Ethan, what do you think if I found a new wife?" His words caught me off guard. I hadn't heard the word mother in so long that it struck me deeply. I looked down at my plate, remembering the day my biological mother left. "Why are you asking me this?" I muttered, trying to keep my emotions in check. My father explained, "I've spent the last 12 years trying to make up for my mistakes and provide for you, but I'm lonely, Ethan. Now that you're grown, I think it's time I started thinking about my own happiness, but I wanted to hear your thoughts first." I paused, realizing how much my father had sacrificed. He deserved happiness, and I had no right to stand in his way. "Dad, I said quietly. "You deserve to be happy. You don't need to ask for my permission." He smiled, visibly relieved. "Thank you, son. I've been seeing someone. Her name is Emily. I'd like to introduce you to her." The following weekend, my father introduced me to Emily. I had stayed up late studying the night before, so I didn't wake up until around 9 a.m. When I came downstairs, I saw a petite woman with long, shiny hair and a bright complexion. She was in the kitchen, preparing lunch. I was momentarily stunned by her beauty. I stood there for a moment, admiring her, when my father's voice startled me. "Ethan, you're finally up." "Good morning, Dad," I replied. Emily turned around, greeting me with a warm smile. "Good morning, Ethan." "Good morning," I said shyly, still trying to process that this beautiful woman was going to be part of our family. She quickly turned back to the kitchen, continuing to prepare the meal. The two of them seemed to be getting along so well that I felt a pang of sadness, realizing that our little family was changing. We all sat down to eat, and Emily placed a piece of pork rib on my plate, smiling warmly. "Try this, Ethan. It's my signature dish." I took a bite and nodded. "It's delicious. Thank you." Throughout the meal, she kept serving me different dishes, her smiles and glances making me feel somewhat awkward. There was something in the way she looked at me that didn't feel right. My father, however, seemed overjoyed that Emily and I were getting along so well. As the meal went on, I noticed her staring at me a little too often. Her glances were filled with something more than just familial affection. I brushed it off, assuming I was overthinking. But deep down, something didn't feel right. Over the next few weeks, Emily visited our home more often. My father and she spent a lot of time together, and I did my best to get used to the new dynamic. However, the uneasiness I felt around her never quite disappeared. Emily wasn't like the evil stepmothers I'd read about in stories. She was kind, attentive, and caring. But there was something off. She was always too attentive, too eager to be close to me. One night after dinner, my father came into my room asking, "What do you think of Emily?" "She's nice, Dad. She seems kind and thoughtful," I replied, trying to keep things light. "She is. You know, she's the daughter of my boss. Emily is 27, and she recently came back from studying in the US, my father added, pride evident in his voice. "Oh, wow," I responded, genuinely surprised. "Yeah, she's amazing. She was the one who made the first move, actually," my dad laughed. I couldn't believe it when she confessed her feelings for me. I forced a smile, trying to seem happy for him, but the strange tension I felt around Emily lingered. As time passed, Emily became a regular part of our lives. I accepted her as my stepmother, but I couldn't shake the odd feeling. Something was growing between us, something that shouldn't have been there. At first, I tried to convince myself that I was imagining it, but soon the signs became clearer. Emily would find excuses to be alone with me, brushing against me when we passed in the hallway, giving me lingering glances. My discomfort grew, but I didn't want to upset my father. He was happier than I had ever seen him. He deserved that happiness after everything he had been through. So I kept quiet, hoping it was all in my head. One weekend, my father mentioned that Emily's parents wanted to meet us to discuss the future. It was clear that marriage was on the horizon. My father asked me to come along, but I refused. I didn't want to face the awkwardness of being around her any more than necessary. "Dad, you go without me. I don't think I need to be there," I said. My father looked disappointed, but didn't press the issue. The following Thursday, my father and Emily went to our family's house to discuss the wedding, leaving me alone at home. When they returned, Emily immediately came to find me. She sat on the edge of my bed, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. "Ethan, why didn't you come with us today?" she asked softly. "I didn't think it was necessary," I mumbled. "Everyone was asking about you," she said, leaning in closer. "I missed having you there." My heart raced. I felt the air between us shift, and suddenly, Emily's hand was on my arm, squeezing it gently. "You know, Ethan," she whispered, "I've been thinking about you a lot lately." I froze. "Emily, this isn't right." But before I could finish, she moved even closer, her breath warm against my ear. "I know it's wrong," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I can't help it. I'm drawn to you, Ethan." I pulled away from her, trying to gather my thoughts. "Emily, this is crazy. You're with my father. This is wrong." But she didn't back down. Instead, she gently touched my face, her fingers tracing my jawline. I know it's wrong, Ethan, but I can't control how I feel about you. I've never felt this way before, and I don't know how to stop it. I stood up abruptly, moving away from her. You need to stop this, Emily. This can't happen. My father loves you. She let out a soft sigh and stood as well. I'm not asking you for anything, Ethan. I just want to tell you how I feel. Please, I said, my voice shaking. Just leave me alone. She gave me one last lingering look before walking out of my room. I stood there for a while, trying to process what had just happened. I knew I had to distance myself from her. This was dangerous, not just for me, but for my father too. I couldn't let this go any further. From that day on, I did everything I could to avoid being alone with Emily. But she seemed determined. Anytime my father wasn't around, she would find a reason to be near me, brushing up against me, or giving me subtle but unmistakable signs of her interest. I tried to keep my distance, but I was still a young man, and the temptation was real. Then, one evening, things took a turn for the worse. It was my 21st birthday, and my father and Emily had organized a small gathering at our home. Most of the guests were my father's colleagues and Emily's friends from work. I hadn't invited any of my own friends except for my best friend Matt. Unfortunately, Matt couldn't make it due to a family trip, so I was left with a room full of adults I barely knew. During the cake-cutting ceremony, my hands trembled slightly from nervousness. Emily noticed and quickly placed her hand on mine. Don't worry, Ethan. I'll help you, she said, with a mischievous glint in her eyes. I glanced at her, trying to smile, but I could feel her closeness, and it made me uncomfortable. My father, who didn't seem to notice anything unusual, simply smiled and continued mingling with the guests. Later in the evening, after most of the guests had left, my father and Emily presented me with a brand new white SH scooter, the one I had wanted for years. I was genuinely surprised and thanked my father excitedly. This was Emily's idea, my father said proudly. I turned to Emily, who was standing beside me, a pleased smile on her face. Thank you, Emily. I love it. Why don't you take it for a test ride, Ethan, she suggested. I'll go grab the keys from my room. Without thinking, I agreed, and Emily went upstairs to get the keys. A few moments later, she called out to me from the top of the stairs. Ethan, come help me find the keys. I hesitated for a moment, but then followed her upstairs. When I entered her room, she closed the door behind me and locked it. My heart sank. Emily, what are you doing? I asked, panic rising in my chest. She walked over to me slowly, her eyes dark with desire. I just want to be close to you, Ethan, she whispered. Before I could react, she wrapped her arms around my neck and pressed her lips to mine. I pushed her away, anger surging through me. What the hell, Emily? Stop this! But she didn't stop. She stepped closer again, her voice soft but insistent. I love you, Ethan. I can't hide it anymore. Just one kiss, please. I tried to turn away, but she was relentless. In my confusion and weakness, I hesitated just long enough for her to kiss me again, and this time I didn't pull back. The feelings I had been suppressing for months came rushing to the surface, and before I knew it, I had given in to the desire. We crossed a line that night, a line I knew we could never uncross. Afterward, guilt and shame consumed me. I couldn't believe what I had done, not just to myself, but to my father. From that night on, everything changed. Emily became even bolder, finding any excuse to be near me when my father wasn't around. I tried to avoid her, but she always found a way to get close. Her touch lingered, her eyes always searching for mine, and I was trapped in a situation I couldn't escape. I was racked with guilt. I couldn't tell my father, but I also couldn't continue living like this. The tension in the house became unbearable, and I knew I had to find a way out. Eventually, I came up with a plan. I decided that the only way to stop this madness was to make Emily think I was in a relationship. That way, she might finally give up on me and focus on my father. There was only one person I could think of to help me with this. Laura, my classmate. Laura was smart, kind, and beautiful, and we had always gotten along well, though we had never been anything more than friends. I figured she would be perfect for this plan, even though I hated lying to her. The next day at school, I asked Laura if we could talk privately. Once we were alone, I explained the situation to her, carefully leaving out some of the more embarrassing details. Wait, Let me get this straight, she said, wide-eyed. Your stepmother has feelings for you, and you want me to pretend to be your girlfriend to get her to back off? I nodded, feeling both embarrassed and desperate. Yeah, it sounds insane, I know, but I don't know what else to do. Laura was silent for a moment before letting out a long sigh. Well, I've never been anyone's fake girlfriend before, but I guess I can help you out. That night, I told my father and Emily over dinner, Dad, Emily, I have something to tell you. They both looked up from their plates. What's up? My father asked. Well, I've been seeing someone for a while now, and I'm planning to bring her over this weekend to meet you both. Her name's Laura. My father's face lit up with joy. That's wonderful news, Ethan. Of course, bring her over. We'd love to meet her. Emily, on the other hand, stiffened, and her expression turned cold. She put her chopsticks down and stared at me. You have a girlfriend now? Yes, I do, I answered, trying to sound confident. Her face hardened, but she didn't say anything further. My father, still oblivious to the tension, was clearly excited and started talking about how much he looked forward to meeting Laura. But throughout the rest of the meal, Emily barely spoke, and I could feel her gaze burning into me. The following Sunday, I brought Laura over to the house. She was wearing a lovely dress that made her look even more beautiful than usual. As we approached the front door, she looked nervous, but I reassured her, Don't worry, just play along, and everything will be fine. I'll do my best, she replied with a nervous smile. We entered the house, and Emily was sitting on the couch, staring at her phone. My father was upstairs working in his study. Laura politely greeted Emily first. Hello, Mrs. Emily, it's a pleasure to meet you. Emily glanced up from her phone with a cold expression. Hi, she said flatly, her voice devoid of warmth. I could sense Laura's uneasiness, so I quickly called up to my father. Dad, Laura's here. My father came down the stairs, beaming. Oh, there she is. Welcome, Laura. Please come in and sit down. We all sat in the living room, and my father immediately began chatting with Laura. So, Laura, how long have you and Ethan been dating? Laura hesitated for a moment, then responded with the lie we had rehearsed. About 6 months now, sir. We've been close for a while, but we only made it official recently. That's great. And you're in the same class as Ethan, right? My father asked. Yes, we study the same major at university, Laura replied, doing her best to sound natural. Throughout the conversation, I noticed Emily watching me and Laura closely. Her eyes followed every word we said, and I could sense her growing frustration. After a while, my father excused himself to take a phone call, leaving me alone with Emily and Laura. The tension in the room became unbearable. Emily broke the silence first. So, Laura, what are your plans after graduation? She asked, but her tone was icy. Laura smiled, though it was clear she was uncomfortable. I'm hoping to get a good job in management, maybe work for a company like Ethan's father does. Emily raised an eyebrow. Well, good luck with that. These days, young people don't seem to stick to anything for very long, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. I clenched my fists under the table, sensing Emily's passive aggression. Before things could escalate, I quickly stood up. Laura, why don't we take a walk in the garden? Laura nodded, relieved. That sounds like a great idea. We left the house and walked around the garden, where Laura finally let out a sigh. Wow, Ethan, your stepmother is something else. She didn't seem happy to see me. I know, I muttered. She's making this harder than I thought, but thank you for playing along. Laura looked at me thoughtfully. Do you think this will really work? Do you think she'll stop whatever she's doing? I hope so, I replied, though I wasn't sure anymore. Unfortunately, my plan didn't work as I had hoped. Instead of backing off, Emily only became more possessive. Her frustration over my relationship with Laura made her even bolder in her advances. One night, after my father had gone to bed, Emily came into my room again. This time, she didn't even try to be subtle. She walked over to me as I was studying, placed a cup of hot milk on the table, and leaned down next to me. Haven't we had enough of this charade, Ethan? She whispered, I know you're just pretending to be with that girl. I pushed my chair back and stood up, trying to keep my distance. Emily, please, this has to stop. My father will find out. She smirked, her eyes narrowing. Do you think he'll believe you? You're his son, yes, but I'm the woman he loves. And trust me, he won't want to believe anything bad about me. I stared at her, horrified. What are you saying? You're willing to destroy my relationship with my father just to, what? Be with me? She stepped closer, her voice dangerously soft. I'm saying that if you want this to end, you'll have to play by my rules, Ethan. You can't run from me forever. I backed away, feeling trapped. I knew she wasn't bluffing. If I didn't find a way out of this mess, everything would collapse. My father would never forgive me if he found out the truth. I had to do something, and soon. Over the next few weeks, I avoided Emily as much as possible. I even changed the lock on my door, but she somehow always managed to find a way in. My attempts to distance myself only seemed to fuel her obsession. It was like she saw me as a prize she had to win. I became more and more isolated. I stopped spending time at home and started studying at a cafe near the university. It was the only place where I could think clearly, away from Emily's constant presence. Laura noticed my growing anxiety and asked me about it one day. Is everything okay, Ethan? You seem really on edge lately. I shook my head. It's not okay, Laura. She hasn't stopped. If anything, it's getting worse. I don't know what to do. Laura frowned, clearly concerned. You can't keep living like this. Maybe it's time to tell your dad the truth. I can't, I said, my voice filled with frustration. He's happy for the first time in years. If I tell him, it'll break his heart. Laura sighed. Then maybe it's time to get out of that house. She was right. I couldn't stay there any longer. The final straw came when Emily tried to corner me in my room late one night. She had brought me yet another cup of milk, her usual excuse to visit my room. But this time, I snapped. Stop it, Emily. Just stop, I shouted. Emily's eyes widened in surprise. She quickly switched to her victim act, pretending to be hurt. Ethan, why are you being so cruel? I just care about you. Don't lie to me, I said angrily. I'm not going to let you ruin my life any more than you already have. Leave me alone, or I'll tell my father everything. Just then, my father appeared at the door. He must have heard me yelling. What's going on in here? He asked, confused. Emily immediately burst into tears, playing the victim yet again. I was just bringing him some milk, and he started yelling at me, accusing me of all sorts of things. I don't know why he's treating me this way. My father turned to me, his face filled with anger and confusion. Ethan, what's going on? Why are you acting like this? I couldn't take it anymore. Dad, she's been harassing me. She's been trying to seduce me for months. My father's face went pale. He looked from me to Emily, who was still pretending to cry. For a moment, he seemed frozen, unable to process what I had just said. Then, his expression hardened. That's ridiculous, Ethan, he snapped. Emily would never do something like that. I'm telling the truth, Dad, I pleaded. She's been coming into my room, touching me, saying things. She even kissed me. You have to believe me. But my father wasn't listening. He shook his head, disbelief written all over his face. You must be confused. I know you're under a lot of stress with school and everything, but accusing Emily of something so outrageous, you're out of line. Emily, still sobbing, chimed in. Jake, I love you. I would never do anything to hurt you. Ethan must be going through something. Maybe he's just confused. Confused? I shouted, feeling a wave of anger and frustration wash over me. I'm not confused. This has been going on for months. You have to see it, Dad, please. But it was no use. My father was already too far gone, too deeply in love with Emily to see her for who she really was. He was willing to overlook any flaw, any sign, because he didn't want to believe the truth. Finally, my father let out a deep sigh and said, I've had enough of this, Ethan. I won't stand for you disrespecting Emily like this. You're lucky I don't throw you out right now. My heart sank. I couldn't believe it. My own father was choosing her over me. So, you're just going to ignore everything I've said? You think I'm lying? I don't know what's going on in your head, but this isn't the way to handle it. Apologize to Emily and let's move on, my father demanded. Emily stood there, looking at me with a mixture of triumph and fake sadness. She knew she had won. I clenched my fists, feeling utterly betrayed. I couldn't stay in that house anymore. I couldn't be around them, not after what had just happened. Fine, I said, my voice breaking. I'll leave. I can't stay here if you won't believe me. My father's face softened for a moment, but he quickly masked it with frustration. If that's what you want, then go. But I'm warning you, Ethan, you're making a huge mistake. I stormed out of the house, not knowing where to go or what to do. I felt utterly lost. The one person I thought I could always count on, my father, had turned his back on me. I wandered through the streets for hours, trying to make sense of everything. Eventually, I went to the only place I knew I could find some comfort, Laura's apartment. When I knocked on her door, she opened it and immediately knew something was wrong. She didn't ask any questions, just hugged me and pulled me inside. "Ethan, what happened?" she asked softly after a few moments. I told my father everything, I said, my voice barely a whisper, and he didn't believe me. He chose her. Laura's expression turned from concern to anger. "How could he not believe you? You're his son." "I don't know," I said, shaking my head. "I guess he just loves her too much. He couldn't see the truth." Laura sighed deeply. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. I wish there was something I could do." "You're already doing enough," I said, grateful for her support. "I don't know what I would have done without you." She smiled softly. "You don't have to go through this alone. I'm here for you, no matter what." That night, I stayed at Laura's place, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a little bit of peace. But I knew that I couldn't avoid my father forever. Eventually, I would have to face him again, and Emily. Over the next few days, I started making plans to move out permanently. I couldn't stay in that house any longer, not with Emily still there. I asked my father for a loan to buy a small apartment, and to my surprise, he agreed, though he still didn't understand why I was so determined to leave. We set up a payment plan, and I quickly found a modest apartment near the university. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and most importantly, it was far away from Emily. As I packed my things and prepared to move out, Emily made one last attempt to get to me. She came into my room as I was boxing up my belongings, her face calm and confident. "You're really leaving, huh?" she asked, her voice light. I didn't look at her. "Yeah, I can't stay here." She took a few steps closer, and I could feel her standing right behind me. "You know, Ethan," she said softly, "this doesn't have to be goodbye. We could still see each other. No one has to know." I turned around, furious. "Are you serious? After everything that's happened, you still think I'd want anything to do with you?" Emily smirked. "I know you're angry right now, but you'll get over it. And when you do, I'll be waiting." I shook my head in disbelief. "You're insane, Emily. I don't know what you're trying to achieve, but it's not gonna work. I'm done with you." She shrugged, unfazed. "Suit yourself. But remember, Ethan, I'm always here. Whether you like it or not, I'm a part of your life now." With that, she walked out of the room, leaving me fuming. I knew she wouldn't stop, but at least I was getting out of that house. I was taking control of my life again. After moving into my new apartment, I focused on rebuilding my life. I threw myself into my studies and spent more time with Laura. She was my rock during this difficult time, and slowly, my feelings for her grew stronger. What had started as a fake relationship to protect myself from Emily had turned into something real. One evening, as we sat together in my apartment, Laura looked at me and asked, "Do you think you'll ever talk to your dad about what really happened?" I sighed. "I don't know. I want to, but I'm afraid it'll just make things worse." "You can't avoid it forever, Ethan. He's your dad. You'll have to confront this eventually." "I know," I said quietly. "But not yet. I'm not ready." Laura reached for my hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Whenever you are, I'll be here." And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't facing this battle alone. Life in my new apartment brought a sense of relief, but it didn't solve everything. The shadow of what had happened with Emily still loomed over me, and the distance between my father and me felt like an ever-widening gap. For weeks, I avoided going back to the house, even though I missed my father. I couldn't bear the thought of facing Emily again or pretending that everything was normal. Laura was right. I couldn't avoid it forever. One afternoon, I received a message from my father. "We need to talk. Please come home this weekend." My heart sank. I knew what it meant. We were finally going to confront everything that had been left unsaid. I dreaded the conversation, but I also knew that I couldn't keep running from it. I needed closure, one way or another. That Saturday, I made my way back to the house. The drive felt longer than usual, filled with the weight of what was about to happen. When I arrived, my father was waiting for me in the living room, sitting in the same spot where so many of our conversations had taken place. but this time the air between us felt heavy. "Ethan," he said as I stepped inside, his voice softer than usual. "I'm glad you came." I nodded, feeling a knot in my stomach. "You said we needed to talk." He sighed deeply, running his hands through his hair. "Yeah, we do. I've been thinking a lot about what you said before, about Emily." I tensed up, unsure of where this was going. "And?" "At first, I didn't believe you," he admitted. "I couldn't. It didn't make any sense. I love her, Ethan, and I thought she loved me, but over the last few weeks, I've noticed things. Things that didn't add up." I sat down across from him, my heart pounding. "Like what?" He leaned back in his chair, looking both exhausted and conflicted. "I overheard her on the phone the other day. She was talking to someone, and it wasn't just a friendly conversation. There was something off about the way she was talking, like she was keeping secrets. And then, I started thinking about how she's been acting lately, how distant she's been with me, but how she always seems to be around you." I swallowed hard, waiting for him to continue. "I didn't want to believe it, Ethan," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I've seen enough to know that something's wrong. I don't know if it's exactly what you said, but I can't ignore the possibility that she's been manipulating both of us." There it was, the crack in the wall. He was starting to see the truth, but he still couldn't bring himself to face all of it. I didn't blame him. It was hard for me to confront too, and I wasn't the one in love with her. "Dad?" I began cautiously. "I didn't want to hurt you by telling you what she did, but I had to. She's not who you think she is." He looked down at his hands, his voice barely a whisper. "I know. I don't know what to do." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The room was filled with the heavy silence of shared pain. Finally, my father sighed and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I don't want to lose you, Ethan. You're my son. No woman, no matter who she is worth losing that." His words hit me hard, and I felt a wave of emotion welling up inside me. For the first time in months, I felt like my father and I were on the same side again. "I don't want to lose you either, Dad." He nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I think it's time I end things with Emily. It's not just because of what you told me, it's because I've realized that she's not the person I thought she was. I need to do what's right for both of us." Hearing him say that was like a weight lifting off my chest. But even as I felt relief, I also felt a pang of guilt. I knew that breaking up with Emily would hurt him deeply, but it was the only way forward. "You're doing the right thing, Dad," I said softly. He gave a small, sad smile. "I hope so." Over the next few days, my father began the painful process of ending his relationship with Emily. It wasn't easy, and I could see the toll it took on him. She didn't go quietly, of course. She pleaded, cried, and tried to convince him that everything was just a misunderstanding. But my father held firm, and eventually, she left our lives for good. After Emily was gone, things slowly started to improve between my father and me. It wasn't an immediate fix. There was still a lot of hurt to work through, but we were rebuilding. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were on solid ground again. Laura was by my side through it all, and as time passed, our relationship deepened. What had started as a fake relationship to protect me from Emily had blossomed into something real, something genuine. She was my anchor in the storm, and I couldn't imagine my life without her. One evening, as we sat together in my apartment, Laura turned to me and asked, "Do you think you'll ever fully get over what happened with Emily?" I thought about it for a moment before answering. "I don't know if I'll ever forget it. It's something that will always be there in the back of my mind. But I think I've learned from it. I've learned about trust, about boundaries, and about not letting people control my life." She nodded, understanding. "And you've come out of it stronger." I smiled, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. "Yeah, I think I have." Life moved on, and so did I. I graduated from university, started my career, and built a new life for myself. My father and I stayed close, and though we never spoke of Emily again, the scars of that time slowly faded. Laura and I continued to grow as a couple, and eventually, our relationship became something much more serious than either of us had originally intended. Through all the pain, the confusion, and the heartbreak, I had found something real. And that was what mattered most.